In this lecture, we are going to create a second helper class, and I'm going to name this class app because this is really going to be used in very many places inside of our application, and it's going to be a very useful class. So we want to declare string type that will be equal to 1. And then inside of here, I want to have a private instance variable called config. This is going to be equal to an empty array. And just like the name stands, we are going to store the application configurations inside of this variable. So we can have a constructor method here. And essentially inside of the constructor method, we want to set the config instance variable to be equal to config, which is our config class, get, and then we pass it the app key. So this is going to return for us the content of this file app.php, which is going to be an array. So right here in config, we now have an array containing all of the key and the values from this file. So we can have our first method here. So this is going to also be a public method. Public function is debug. So we're going to use this to determine if we are in debug mode or we are not in debug mode. Remember, I told you previously that in debug mode, we want to show debug error messages. But if we are not in debug mode, that means we don't want to show error messages. We just want to show like a really helpful message for the user. Otherwise, we're going to be showing a lot of information. So this function helps us to check if we are in debug mode. So what we can do is to have one more check here to say if it's not set. So if we don't have a debug key inside of this file for any reason, we're just going to return false, which means that we are not in debug mode. So if we don't have debug here, we're going to return false. Okay, in our case, this is not going to happen because we have the debug key, but this is just a way for us to have one more extra check here. And then here we can now return this config debug. This is going to return a boolean. Remember in the app.php file, we actually set this to be equal to true, and it can also be false. All right, so that's the first method that we are creating here. And as you can see that my methods are actually having return types. If you are using a PHP version that doesn't support return type, all you need to do to make this work is to remove the return type. The same thing for the type inting that I have here. So I say here that I have string. This will only work in PHP 7. Okay, if you're not using PHP 7, you also need to remove this. But I'm pretty much sure that everyone watching this series should be using at least a minimum PHP 7.1 or 7.2. So we want to create one more method. So we're going to have public function get environment. So this is going to help us determine if we are in production environment or we are in development environment or we're in local development environment. So it's going to return a string. And we are going to do a check just similar to this. So we can actually grab this code to make things a little bit faster. So right now we're going to be looking for env. So which is the environment, okay? So this is a little bit dicey. We cannot return false here, but we can actually return, we just return production if you don't set this value. This could be local or this could be anything. But if this is not set, we want to just return production. Then we're going to have one more public function get log path. So this is going to be the part where we are actually logging to in our application. This is also going to return a string. So what we can do is to also grab this, because we're doing something similar here. And then we can say log underscore path. Let's say log path. So for the case of the log path, if this is not set, it's probably okay for us to throw an exception. So we're going to throw new exception. So we're going to be updating all of this later, but for now, we're just going to be saying log path is not defined. So we say log path is not defined. So this is never going to happen for our case because we have this value already defined. Then the next one that we want to create will be a function that helps us to check if PHP is running from the command line. So there's different ways for us to run a PHP script. We can run it from the browser, or we can be running it from the command line. So we need a way to be able to check if PHP is running from the command line. This will be useful for us maybe during our test cases, so that we know that this is being called from the command line or this is being called from the browser. So we have public function is running from console, and this is going to return a boolean. So this will be true or false. And the way that we want to determine that is to use the inbuilt PHP function. So we're going to say return PHP underscore sappy. So that will be underscore sappy underscore name is equal to CLI. So CLI is the command line interface, or PHP underscore sappy underscore name is equal to PHP BG. So you can actually look at the declaration of this function if you're using a good test editor. So it returns the type of interface between web server and PHP. So basically it tells us where PHP is running. Now we're just limiting that to CLI and PHP BG. So there are other values that are here, but if we determine that this is actually CLI, so we know that it's a command line. It's running from the command line. So there could be other values as defined here. So we're just going to return that. And then the last one that we'll be creating for now will be a function that helps us to get the server time. So it's a public function, get server time. And this is going to essentially return the PHP date time interface. So what I want to do is to just come here and say use PHP datetime interface. We also want to use PHP datetime, and we also want to use PHP date time zone. Then come back here. Then I could get rid of this. And then I will say return no date time, and it's always going to be the current time because we're looking for the time of the server, and then we're going to pass it a default time zone. So I'm going to just pass it my time zone. So my time zone is basically Europe. So that's going to be Europe Berlin. So easy, you can just check the PHP documentation to actually see your own time zone value. And now we have our EPA class here. Okay, so pretty sweet. We can now use this to easily find that specific information within our application. We don't need to then worry about the config file because we have pretty much handling most of the value here. All right, so let's quickly test this out. We're going to come here and I'm going to get rid of this. And now we want to say application. So this is going to be our application. It's going to be equal to new up. And then we're going to essentially just echo out a few things here. So again, let's say echo application. Then we can call few of the methods here. So the first one will be to get server time. Then we can say PHP end of line. Then we can duplicate that. So say get log path. Then the next one will be get environment. And then the last one will be is debug mode. Okay, we also have running from console. So let's say that it's running from console. And that's it. Okay, so this essentially is saying toString is not implemented. And the reason here is because we are returning a datetime interface. So we can do a var dump on it to return everything, or we can actually just chain in to say we want to pass in a format. So we can pass in a format like this to say we need year, month, day, or whatever format that we actually want. So year dash m, so let's say dash day, and we can also say we need the hour, the minutes, and the seconds. Okay, so this will be a way to return a string implementation. So if we run this on index, so basically we get the current date and time, we get our log path, we get our current environment, we get one for is debugged, which tells us that we are currently in debug mode, and then we get one which tells us that actually PHP is running from the console. So to just test it out, it will probably help for us to open a browser and see how this will actually display. Okay, so let's quickly see this on Chrome. I'm going to just say localhost, and this is going to be the folder name. So the folder name should be bug dash report dash app. I think so. So let's say index.php. I just hope I'm getting the folder name correctly. The date, we have the log path, we have the environment, is debug is 1, and then we don't see anything for it's running from console because it's 0. So when it's false, PHP returns 0. So let's say here we can have an if statement to say if this is true. So if it is running from console, we're going to say echo from console. Otherwise, we're just going to say echo from browser. And then we can actually do a reload on the browser now. And you see from browser. With this, we know that everything works as expected. And just to have a recap, we now have an app class that essentially helps us to get very important information. We can determine the server time, we can get our log path, we can determine the environment, we can also check if our application is running in debug mode, and we can also check if it is running from the console. So these are pretty important things that we will need later on as we begin to develop the application.